So what we're going to take a look at now is an alternative to using data annotations, and that's to add a package called Fluent Validation. Now it's quite a common technique when using the mediator pattern to add the Fluent Validator in between the command and the handler. So basically we receive our, in this case, our activity inside our create command, and then we validate against what we've got here, and if we fail validation, then we don't pass the request to the handler, and we pass back that 400 model state error to the client. So what we need to add is Fluent Validation. So I'm just going to open up the NuGet package manager and say add package. And what we want to look for in here is Fluent Validation, and I'll press return. And this will give us a big old list of Fluent Validation related libraries, but the one that we want to use, and I'll just scroll down in this list, is fluentvalidation.aspnet core. So let's go ahead and add this one. And the latest version at the time of recording is 8.5.1. Now 8.5 and above are the only ones that are compatible with .NET Core 3.0, so we can't go lower than this, so we want the latest one anyway. So let's go ahead and select this, and we want to add this into our application project. It's our business logic that's going to be responsible for validating our requests. So let's add it to this, and let's go ahead and click on the restore option. Now we've got some problems because our project is having trouble loading, so let's take a look at the output here. And if we scroll up, then and we get an error somewhere here, although this is quite busy. So I'm just going to go to the terminal, and I'm just going to stop the application because we've got problems anyway. And let's just go up to the reactivities folder. So I'm just going to go up a level, and let's just do a .NET restore in here so we can see the output a bit more clearly. And this time it seems to work just fine. So let's try a .NET build to see if we get any errors when we build our application. And it says this is absolutely fine, which admittedly has come as a bit of a surprise to me actually, because I was expecting this to at least show an error. Now, the reason I was expecting an error here is because the Fluent Validation for ASP.NET Core, there's no version of this that targets the .NET Standard 2.1 framework. And in theory, we should have seen an error there, but my console is not showing it just now. But we'll continue as though there is no error, and just to see if we can actually configure this and get this working. I don't think we will be able to, but since we've not seen an error so far, let's just continue as we would do normally. Now our goal here is to add some validation, and the typical pattern is to add our Fluent Validator in between our command and our handler. So what's going to happen is our activity is going to be passed into our command, and then we're going to validate against these properties, or at least we're going to start with the title just to make sure that we've got Fluent Validation configured and set up correctly. So the way that we do this is we add an additional class in between the command and the handler, and what I'm going to do is say public class, and we'll call it command validator, and this is going to derive from abstract validator, and this is a Fluent Validation class, and what we tell our abstract validator is the class that we want to validate against, and in this case it's going to be our command class. Now we're getting the red underline here, and what we should be able to do at this point, because this is spelled correctly, and what we should be able to do is add the using statement for Fluent Validation. Now if I just come up to the top and I try and add this manually and say Fluent Validation, then it looks like this is where the error is going to surface, and this is unusual. I would have expected this to be highlighted when we try to restore the packages, but now we definitely do have a problem. So I'm just going to comment this out and see if we can resolve this particular problem, and let me show you why I think we should have a problem here. If I go across to the browser and I take a look at the package we've installed inside NuGet.org, then if we take a look at its dependencies, then we can see that this is only valid for .NET Core App 3.0 and .NET Standard 2.0. Now because we're targeting .NET Standard 2.1, that's why I think we should be seeing a problem here, but for whatever reason my code editor is not highlighting that. And if we compare this with Entity Framework Core, we can see this is targeting Net Standard 2.1. So what we're going to need to do to get around this, and this is the only way that I've found to get around this particular problem, is we need to target Netcore App 3.0 in all of our class libraries. Now the Microsoft recommendation is to start as low as you can, and Net Standard 2.0 would be the lowest point. But if you rely on packages that are only targeting Net Standard 2.1 or Netcore App 3.0, we really need to change it to the one that's most compatible for our particular project. And in this case, it's Netcore App 3.0. So what I'm going to do is go back to our application project, and instead of targeting Net Standard 2.1, we're actually going to change this to Netcore App 3.0. And this is going to be the same for all of our class libraries. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to go to Explorer. And simply by nature of changing this, I've got all sorts of warnings here, but we'll correct these very shortly. And I'll just go to the domain project, and we'll need to do the same in this one. So we'll update this to Netcore App 3.0. We'll also go to our persistence project and do the same thing in here and target Netcore App 3.0. And then what we can do is we can go back into our command line, and we can just try and do a .NET restore, which should, in theory, resolve these problems. And it might take a few seconds for that to acknowledge the fact that these problems are now resolved, but resolved they are. Now, in theory, and let's see if this works, we can go back to our create class, and I'm just going to uncomment what I had here. And let's see if we can now bring in Fluent Validation, and now it's available for us to make use of. So let's bring this in here. So now we've worked around that particular issue, let's go ahead and actually add some rules inside here. And the way that this works is we need to add a constructor for our command validator. So let's just use the quick fix and generate the constructor for command validator. Now it doesn't take any parameters, and what we can do inside here is specify some rules. So we'll just start off as simply as possible, and we'll create a rule for just to make the title a required property. So I'll add an expression and say x goes to title, and then we can chain on various rules in this particular validator. So if I just add a period, then we could see all of the different options that we have available inside Fluent Validation. So a large number of options here. We can make sure that things are greater than or greater than and equal to, and we have options for things like email address and credit card, all of normal validation kind of things you would expect to see. But the one that we're going to go for is just to check that the value is not empty. And what this means is that validation will fail if the property is null, an empty string, white space, an empty collection, or the default value for the type. So we'll go for this one. So we'll go for not empty, and this is the one that we'll use to test our rules. Now before we can use Fluent Validation, we also need to configure this in our startup class. So let's take a look at that. And what we need to do here is add some additional configuration to our add controllers method. So what we'll do is we'll specify add Fluent Validation, and let's see if we can bring this in. And yep, we can bring in using fluentvalidation.ASP.NET Core. And we need to give this some additional configuration because we need to tell it which assemblies contain our validators. So that's going to be our application project. But what we'll do is we'll give this some options, and we'll say CFG for config. And inside here we'll say CFG.register validators from assembly containing is the one that we want. So this third one on the list, and this is the one that we'll go for. And then we need to specify a class that lives inside this particular assembly. So because we're working on the create class, I'll just add this particular one in. And we'll just close off these brackets. So we only need to specify one particular class because this method here, it's going to register all the validators from the assembly that contains our create class. So basically anything inside our application project, it's going to look for any validators and register them in our services here. So now we have that in place, we can go ahead and restart our application. So I'm just going to cd into the API and just do a .NET watch run. So with this in place, we'll now be able to go back to Postman, and what we're looking for is the same kind of response. We want to see a 400 bad request when we try and create an empty activity. So let's head back to Postman. So I'll just resend this request one more time, and what we see is exactly the same kind of response as we got when we were using data annotations. So this is successful. So what we'll do is we'll just go back to our create command and we'll just copy this rule down 5 more times and just do it for the rest of our properties, including description, category, dates, etc. So I'll just say description and category and dates and city and venue, and just make sure that all of these are going to be validated properly. And I'll click send again, and this time we see all of our validators hitting for each of these different properties that we're not providing. And we should just make sure that we can actually create an activity. So I'm just going to use the earlier creation of the create activity, and if I click on send, then we get the 200 OK. So we also just need to do the same for our edit command, and this is really just going to be a copy and paste job because our edits is using the same properties. So I'm just going to literally paste this into here as well and just bring in Fluent Validation, and that looks good. So let's just go and test our edit activity, and let's just choose this particular request, the edit activity with missing fields. But I do need to get the ID of a activity, so let's just get the ID of the activity that we've just created, and I'll paste this into my Postman request to put this, and if I click send, then we see all of our validators inside here, including the title. And if we click on edit an activity correct and send this one should work fine, although I need to update the URL to the activity that we've just created, and then I'll click send, and then we get the 200 OK. Okay, so that's what we're going to do for validation on our server side. We will come back to Fluent Validator later on for other things that we send up to our server, but this is what we're going to use to validate in our application. And what we're going to take a look at next is error handling in our API.